and thank you for joining us at the 11th edition of Expo Chicago, the International Exposition for Contemporary and Modern Art. My name is Taylor Payton. I'm the assistant to artistic director, Kate Sears-Patowski. Whoop! And it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the Dialogue stage presented in partnership with the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. Dialogues offers panel discussions like this one, provocative artist discourse with leading artists, curators, designers, and arts professionals on current issues that engage them. This evening, in partnership with Aperture, I'm excited to welcome to the stage designer Silas Munro and artist Paul Sepuya to preview the upcoming release of Darkroom A to Z, which is Sepuya's most comprehensive monographic release to date. The book is edited by Leslie Martin of Aperture. The conversation is moderated by Drew Sawyer, curator at the Whitney Museum for American Art. Thank you.
Great. Well, thank you all for being here, and thank you to Expo for inviting us. And we're actually going to begin with two presentations, and then we'll jump into questions and then open it up to you all. But thank you all for joining. I see some familiar faces, so I appreciate the turnout. So I'll hand it over to Paul first.
Okay. We're going to be talking about this process of this forthcoming book called Darkroom A to Z, which, you know, I guess the earliest ideas of it kind of started in the summer of 2017 in conversation with Leslie at Aperture. What we're going to kind of go through, and once we can get to the slides, is this way in which my process has been so tied to indexing and archiving, record keeping, even though like it's grounded in portraiture and photography. But something I also kind of want to point out is what's also really important with it is that like I had a whole career in arts administration in New York, and a lot of that was working with artist archives, working with foundations. And so one of the things that I've always enjoyed about that was the way in which it mapped so much onto my own process, and I learned so much of that over the years. So this project that we'll get into soon is, it kind of started off with this idea of like how to index everything, how to draw the connections through like the social web of the work as that crosses over various projects and as the work has grown and changed over the last like 20 some years. But the scope of that, the realistic boundaries of a publishing project, of funding, of paper, of who wants to carry a giant app, but like it's impossible to work with thousands upon thousands of images. It got it narrowed down to one specific project, which was Darkroom, roughly 2016 to 2021. And then it was around in 2020 when Silas and I started like brainstorming these ideas. And now it's also fun because we're neighbors. So like, it's like we could just walk from house to house in LA and just like talk about this stuff. Anyways, okay, here we go. Darkroom A to Z. So the unifying thing about this that I want to talk about is this idea of sort of studio time. And so I'm going to start with like an early portrait. This is a portrait of my friend Darren. This is from a project that was called Beloved Object and Amorous Subject that became a first book that I did, and I'll show images of that. But I want to show several images made with Darren over the years that kind of show this evolution in the work. This is 2006. This is probably the third time that he sat for me. Here is in 2011. This one was made in the Studio Museum in Harlem. But the image here, this is where you start to see this kind of like recursiveness happening in the photographs. It's a portrait of Darren from the prior June, rephotographed in my studio at the time, that next September. But we also see this sort of like layering a partial image, which is a portrait of my friend Joshua, and you can see a bit of his turban behind there and these other little things that are happening. Here is an image from, I believe, is this 2018? Yeah, 2018. And we can see the shift into the Darkroom project that we're going to sort of be talking about here. Here's another, a portrait of Victor from 2010. Here is an image also made with Victor in 2017. Another thing about this that kind of becomes interesting with this Darkroom project is the work begins to move from a kind of like indexing by revealing names, by titling through names, and incorporating this idea of concealing. But in a way, the thing I was really interested in works like this was that if you lived in New York, if you wandered around Greenpoint or Williamsburg or something, you would know this is that you like, he's just that person with that afro who's always just like out and around. But people talked about this work as if there was so much about concealing, but I was really interested in like proximity and intimacy and recognition as ways of navigating the work. Here's a later image with Victor in 2019, which kind of, again, starts to do this recursiveness. I was really interested in the phones that are happening, but that's a whole other sort of story. But this is sort of what I was thinking about, this idea of studio time, but there was already this indexing that was happening. Here's another image that really points to this idea of studio time, but also something that I think about this is like images that hold multiple, like one moment in time, let's say March 12th, 2011, holds all these other fragments in there. We see in the upper right corner a fragment of a self-portrait from the prior December. In the lower left, we see out of focus a blurry test portrait of my friend Tony. We have Jeffrey's boots that are left behind. This is the kind of indexing that I was thinking about when this initial idea of like, how do I bring with a single picture like this, let's say like prior projects where I have photographed Jeffrey, but he's no longer in this image, but we have his boots. How do we bring the prior self-portraits that I have? How do we connect, for example, those sheets that I brought from my room in Brooklyn into the studio and all the other places that those had appeared? This was this idea of like this overwhelming sort of a thing. Here is an installation that was at Sekuma Jenkins in 2017 of further development in this kind of indexing process for a project called Some Recent Pictures, which I'll show a couple more images of it, but it actually kind of began conversations with Kay Sophie Rabinowitz over here in the summer of 2013 on Fire Island. And you know, what's really great about that is so much of, for me, this idea of like understanding how indexing works came from my inspiration in literature and these literary references. And so those conversations, it helped me sort of frame all of this work that I was doing through how the indexes of books, how you cross genre from, let's say, the indexing and formalization of an artist or writer's diaries, how that then becomes source for memoir, which has another relationship to audience, to then, for example, autobiography, or something I was really inspired by is Virginia Woolf's index in Orlando, which is a totally fictional index around a real person, but then you know, you can read the writings of like Vita Sackville-West and Harold Nicholson and Violet Trefusis, and they all provide these other genre contexts that feed back in. Anyways, I'm going off on a tangent, but let's just go to this image here, like studio from 2021. Here, again, we have this thing that started like years ago at the Studio Museum that was then pulling from the prior portraits of all of these subjects who are friends and fellow artists, like in a single image that holds all these other connections. You can see here my own image, you can see Victor, you can see John, you can see these other fragments of the studio. But here, into the more of the indexing part, this is a book that I did, it was like a self-published book that I did with Felix Burichter, and it was the second book that I had done, but this one was of the Studio Museum project, and it was the second big indexing project. The first one was the prior Beloved Object book, but this one was more of an inspiration for what we're kind of getting into. This is the first volume of Some Recent Pictures that I was mentioning, developed in conversation with Kay Sophie. And what that was is, there's now 10 volumes of them. I don't know if you knew that. But they are binding of loose notes, test prints, laser prints, Xeroxes, other things, bound together So it's not a book that is published. They're not volumes that are like published. But here we can see this is the index of that first volume that has, it locates all of my original images, any citations, etc. So this is a map for the idea of the index. And then I'll wrap it up with a proof of concept going into this. So this was one of the first works that we were talking about. It's like, there's so many references happening in a single work. Like, this is literally like notations on my studio wall. We have everything from my own iPhone images to like Bouguereau's Water Girl to like a still from The Bitter Tears of Petra von Kant to a fragment of Matisse, back to all of this arts admin work I did. Here is a really, I'm sorry this is so hard to see, but I started off by sending Silas screenshots from my database where I was connecting all of the references in every work, and we were like, how do we start to design based off of this? Here's another one, but since they're so small, I'm not going to linger. Then what happened is I have an amazing studio manager, and I had a former student, and she joined us initially as an intern, and we went through all of the writing, my own artist statements and notes, and pulled together maybe like a 400-page Google Doc of everything, and Hope and Nico moved it into the categories under which the subjects existed. We used that as a framework, merged that with the names of every friend who had sat in the studio, and we created an alphabetical index that then became a framework for the book. Those categories then were emptied out, and then we started to repopulate them with images and new commission text, as well as pulling in key other texts. This is a screenshot of that index. And this is sort of what the design is kind of like looking like now. And it combines names, abstract concepts, topics in an alphabetical index, A to Z, of everything that happened in that studio space over the course of a project. And I'll just try to leave it at there.
Wait, can I ask a quick question? Because
Yeah.
I'm just curious, because this is really the first time I'm also seeing some of the spreads.
Okay.
So because as you pointed out, the early work included people's names, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which was like an identifying category. But since those were populated initially, but then you removed it and added pictures which titles don't match up. So are
now,
they,
yes, there
in the
are
index?
names. So
Okay.
for example, here, this is a spread from James Francisco Garcia. So now, the interesting thing is this book does include the names, and having the names allows you to see where across various works that may have been published or may not have been, or not yet published, where figures come through, because let's say the image on the right, someone just viewing that work may not know the figures that are involved in that. The last thing I'll sort of say about that is, in this process, it was an extensive process of then checking in with everyone in how they wanted to be listed. People's names change. Sometimes people want to be listed an initial anonymously, or a first initial and a last name, etc. And so then that also shifted the index as well. It is a very complicated process, yes. And then here we see this is the spread for Joe Osmond. It includes some of his writing about my work, but also various ways in which he's appeared in the work as well. Yeah. And I'll hand it off to Silas. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. This is really exciting to talk about and like share this process that's been like very collaborative and very intimate. I don't think I've ever had a design process that was so like interwoven, and so it just feels really special to like share that with everyone here. And I feel like it's a reflection of the way like your work is really shining light on like connection and community and like tender moments, and captures it in a way that feels very like beautiful and then also like fleeting. So I feel like that was like a very complex brief to try to encounter and like tackle like how do you get typography or how do you get a piece of design to express that. And so I'm just showing a little bit of like other fragments of like Polymode's work as a studio, which is a collaboration. And so I was one of the designers of the book, but also my business partner, Brian Johnson, and Mel Schill Lamb in our studio also has worked really hard on this book. And just showing fragments of our work. Polymode, which is in the name of the studio, we're very interested in this idea of like many ways of working in many styles and modes. And I feel like that really showed up in the work that we were doing. And for us, we're also really interested in the earlier phases of a project. And we use this term called poetic research. I think in design, conventionally, historically, the idea is that design is this very linear, rational process where you're like going step by step by step, and then you have like this beautiful object at the end. And at Polymode, we just really acknowledge that that's not true, that there's like a lot of emotions and feelings and materials. And so poetic research like also allows the designer's voice and lived experience to come in. And so like design can also look like this, you know, where you're like, just things are coming in different ways. And like Paul and I were like listening to music while we were like talking about the book. So we make a playlist for every project and share that because there's like people working on the project like all over the world or across the country. And so these are just a couple of like detail slides of other poetic research documents. So there's kind of like fragments of artworks and typefaces we're thinking about and materials and other forms. And so it is this kind of process of like kind of collating different ideas and different sort of references. And I think one of the things we share in terms of citation is also like queer histories and like BIPOC histories of both artists and designers. This was from a workshop at the Walker Art Center that we did called Our, which was about like surfacing BIPOC and QTPOC design histories in collaboration with other people. And so when we came to this book, of course, we were also looking at like your past books and like a number of your works and thinking about this brief, but also thinking about histories of other indexes. And so we did a number of studio visits where Paul and I were like looking at different books. One that was like a key one is this experimental jet set book called The Index of Fragments. They're a Dutch collective, and they basically collated all these different writings about and statements they had made about different aspects of their work. So there was like this common like set of collections. There was, we were also thinking about just histories of dictionaries and like indexes, even like back to like cuneiform tablets. There was another book that was really important called Marketing on the Left, which was this book that was typeset only in one typeface with no bold or hierarchy, and it was just using color and then these margins to sort of express different levels. And it's kind of like the Talmud, like this kind of like citational cross-referencing. And so we were also looking at other publications. One of the key texts that you reference is A Smoke, Lilies, and Jade by Richard Bruce Nugent, which is in this Fire publication from 1926. And so this collective of like queer Black folks like making a publication together was like a reference. Another reference was BLK Magazine by Alan Bell, who is an amazing graphic designer based in Los Angeles, who made this publication that was sort of pointing to Ebony, but also pointing to Life magazine, but is this like queer reference. And one of the most interesting things was the classified like personals in the back of the publication, which had these also kind of rows of information and like intimate connections. And then the last publication that we looked at was this book called Men of Color by this artist Vega. He was friends with Essex Hempel and Marlon Riggs in kind of the late 80s and early 90s in New York, and like part of these movements of AIDS activism. And he made this book that in 1989 that just has this really beautiful like portraiture of men together, but also like poems and texts and these really beautiful illustrations. So that idea of like, there's a lot of information, but also how do you retain the intimacy as well? And to also like deal with the structure of so much complexity, we're very interested in this idea of like sacred geometry and the underlying grid that's on the page. So there's a very intentional structure so that there's plenty of room for like all of the information. And then when it came to choosing the typefaces for the publication, when we were like starting the project, we were just finishing this typeface for our studio called Polymode Sans, and we were referencing this like early, like end of the 19th century, early 20th century typeface called Lining Gothic, and we were working with this type design studio XYZ Type to add this other like variable like index of realness. So instead of just being a generic sans serif, it also kind of would morph in shape. I'll talk about that in a second. And we wanted to pair that with this contemporary typeface Tiempos, which is based off of like Times New Roman. So having these kind of like default typefaces, but then these like contemporary revivals of them became really important. And so that Polymode Sans has like bold, italic, but then it has like a very like more acting basic, and then it also has this like more opulent kind of version of itself. And so that different weights of those texts became these ways to how to make all those like references legible. And so we experimented with different configurations, like do we try to run the information and stack it vertically? Do we like run it underneath the images? And so we really had just this like investigation in play, including sort of like, oh, do we reference more literally dictionaries and this kind of coding? But we felt like that felt too heavy-handed and like just kind of overwhelmed it. But part of the design process is just like trying things. And I feel like the thing that was so beautiful about the collaboration was like each thing we made for each other was like a key to unlock how the other person was thinking.
Totally. Call and response.
Yes, because I was like,
hey.
I couldn't, like, even though, like, I knew about your work and was, like, admiring, like, part of the process, it was, like, we couldn't, like, conceptualize it until we saw it. Mm-hmm. And I feel like that was really important to, like, print things out and, like, share. And we did a lot of working sessions also together, like, side by side, where we were, like, trying things. And then starting to figure out like what could be a cover image and like what kind of material form the book could have. And we kept coming back to this idea of like a textbook. Like how could you have something that almost feels like a journal that's almost nondescript? And then kind of found this like library book, like material, which also kind of was similar to some of the like muslin and scrims that you were using in your work. And so this is a kind of final rendering of like what the cover is going to look like. And part of the front and back image was also about like having one image that was like embedded in another image on the back. So there's this kind of connection of recursiveness that's like physically like from the front to the back of the book. And then Paul showed some spreads of this front matter index. And then some of this like zones of typography of thinking about where some quotes take up more space at sometimes. And then Gokchan's text, which I don't think you mentioned, do you want to talk about that?
Yeah, thank you. I was like, we forgot. Okay, one key thing that I have to mention and thank is Gokchan Demirkazek, who is an amazing PhD student at UCLA. I met at a symposium. They invited me a few years ago. And he had contributed some text actually for Document Gallery for a show back in 2018, or I can't remember, 2018 or 2021. Time is weird. Post-COVID, we're still in COVID. But, and so he was invited and we commissioned him to go through all of these index categories, go through all of the research that we had assembled and write new text on selected categories. So this is interwoven. Could you go back to that last slide? So one of the things that like Silas came up with was this idea of these 3 columns. So in the first column, you see in the categories that run down. The second column pulls my own quotes, notes, past artist statements, etc. And then the third column is the commission text from Gokchan. And so that's what follows through the entire book. And then what we see in that second or under like accountability, which is that category that kind of spreads across there. Those that are slightly bolder are existing texts that we're citing by other writers.
Nice. And then there's just kind of moments where like the images become this kind of index, like with Aperture, where like there's no text at all, which I think is really beautiful. But then there's also very dense moments where there's so many names and words and quotes kind of overlapping, like this cruising spread. And there's kind of multiple definitions of this ambiguity of what is the answer when you look it up is like cross-referencing. And then, a little playlist from what we were listening to.
Yeah, great. Well, thank you for that little preview. It's exciting. I mean, in part because I was working with you both on separate projects beginning in 2019 over the course of while you were working on this book. So I heard it both from Silas and the sort of complications, and then I heard a little bit from you. So it's exciting to see how this came to shape, and maybe we can talk about some of the complications later. Also, I mean, I do have to say, at the beginning of the talk, while we were experiencing some technical difficulties, you talked about your experience or your interest in like archiving and indexing in your studio work, but just broadly. And I have to say, like, working with you, I've never seen an artist who is so organized. Your studio is just so, it was really kind of remarkable. So I can see how it not only shows in your work, in your book, but I know you didn't, I don't think you showed an image of your database that you were going to.
Kind of skipped over it. The screenshots were too small.
But anyways, so it's kind of all makes sense. Now, I had a question for you, Paul, maybe just to start, and we were thinking about, you really showed that progression of your work from, the early 2000s to the 2010s, and that sort of shift and recursiveness that started to happen. And I was thinking about, of course, photography as a tool of indexing and categorization, of course, through like the mugshot or other forms of portraiture, especially in the 19th century. That are, of course, still used today to categorize and index people. And I was thinking, you were included in the project called Machine Manifestos, Artists Who Make Zines, which was one of your first publishing projects beginning in 2005, which was focused on portraits of single individuals, right, who were photographed in multiple sittings or over the course from different. And I was recalling how David Velasco called that project, or the way he thought of that was in the lineage of August Saunders' People of the 20th Century, which is kind of the photographing indexing project by an artist, which tried to photograph different German types in the early 20th century, although it was not completed. And so you moved from that sort of more traditional photographic portraiture practice to this more recursive. You were talking about strategies of concealment. So I'm just curious if you could talk a little bit about, how you moved away from that kind of indexing, but of course, indexing features in other ways rather than just through indexing an individual according to a name or a category.
Yeah. So I think part of the thing around indexing is also having to really clearly understand what you're accountable towards. And so from those initial projects, like the indexing that was happening in each zine was sort of taking all of the outtakes, sort of like rejecting this idea of like having to settle on a single portrait in these, making this work with sittings with friends, and saying, okay, I can use the entire layout of a zine to kind of give the entire sort of shoot. But then once you have enough, once a project develops to a certain point, you have to start to organize it. And then it goes out into the world. And even if I wasn't intending for it to be like I wasn't intending it to be a kind of documentary of a social place and time, it becomes that, especially as you have audiences who are outside of that. And so that was a point where I had to make the decision that I was going to keep the projects within those social networks that I moved in and those people that I was close with, rather than as it became like, oh, is this a documentary of Williamsburg 2005? That requires then, like Saunders, saying, who are the people living in this community? I have to go outside of myself and map it in a different way. So that's something that it's completely subjective. But then within that, I think as time passes, everything becomes a document, everything becomes an accidental documentary. You learn so much, I think, as an artist over time. But yeah, so I would say, you know, Saunders, and that is much more like it has a political position of Germany at that time, you know, and part of making visible the entire, you know, as much as it was attempting across society, was about countering the developing narrative, you know, that's happening about like, okay, Germanness can only mean one thing, and so that's why that work was, you know, pushed aside. So, anyways, yeah, it's. Am I answering that? Yeah, there's a kind of like
a little bit, but I also was curious about your move away from that kind of portraiture, which is associated with indexing and categorization.
Okay,
and right, it included names that were identifiable, and then you move away, you remove some of the information, you use different formal strategies within the studio to resist that form of indexing that photographs just naturally do, as we were saying, right, through and as time passes through the document. But you know, those early photographs serve as that, but your work no longer can serve that function actually without the apparatus of this book, right? And so in a way, the book is providing the index that the photographs don't hold, that the photographs don't reveal themselves in the same way.
Yes, the book in a way is a bold experiment in undermining what I've been doing for the last 7 years. I think in getting to your point, I was really naive in that early work, and I don't think I was aware of how fast the images were spreading, how they were disseminating. It being like the whole thing about like Machine Manifestos is it was situated at that moment of like the queer zines explosion and Butt magazine and all this stuff, and that work became notorious. And so the work circulated before we even had an understanding of what it meant to ourselves. And so part of pulling back on that was like kind of rejecting the way in which, and it was interesting to see how it slowed down on the works, because it, like, I think especially like queer communities, like image making, portrait making, like is like even more so like an economy, and an economy shaped by desire and shaped by like everything from manipulation to flotation. I think that's why I'm interested in figures like Bruce Nugent and Carl Van Vechten, etc. It's like, and Truman Capote, it's like everyone knew how to use these things. But I think by removing names, it was interesting to see how suddenly they did not travel the way they did through social channels. And it kind of slowed things down. Those friends who are in the work, I love when they push it out there in ways, but like it's something that I've held back on. But now this book is suddenly like, it's interesting to see, because one thing we didn't get into is like so much of the design process has been like citations and see alsos, and like you'll be able to kind of like look up a category, and even if you're looking up so-and-so's name, it might point you to like categories where you didn't even know there was like a person in the work. And so, but I think the book format still holds back on some of the ability for things to just move in a detached way. Yeah.
I mean, I'm curious because you both, as Silas, you showed even with Polymode, you both have such citational practices, this sort of poetic research. And obviously for both of those, in the visual arts, are not immediately apparent to readers, viewers who aren't in the know, right? It's not like a book that has citations with footnotes that reference what the author is referring to, right? Those sort of formats. So I'm curious, if that's important for you to reveal those sources, right? And so much of the visual arts, it's about being in the know, to know those sources, and that's what partially creates subcultures or cultures around certain kinds of artworks, or those people who share the knowledge, the secret knowledge. And of course, that's so important for queer histories, right? Where that knowledge had to be secret or coded in some way. So I'm interested, in your choice to make that knowledge apparent when it was kind of withheld, and just for you too, just like those references, like how you see those traveling within your designs.
Yeah, I feel like the citation's really important. Mainly also to see yourself in history. I think as a queer person of color, like the lineages and the histories are like not in the canon, or not historically in the canon. And so part of me citing the things I find is I wish someone had cited things for me. And so I think especially like fire and that particular document and the story of Richard Bruce Nugent, like telling this fictional account of his own encounters with other men in this like public presentation of this magazine that's really beautifully designed at this like very critical moment of art history and culture in New York and our world. Like, and it's just very meaningful, I think, to have that. And then also the kind of desire aspect of it, to sort of see other artists who are kind of working with things that I've felt and like have kind of felt like I had to hold back or like not delve into. And so to have this kind of kindred spirit, I feel like the citations are like breadcrumbs, like Alan Bell, like, you know, or like Willie Smith, or just like other references that like I feel like I found late. And so it's like a catch up and feels like it's important to kind of share those and acknowledge them and like, I think push back against, especially in graphic design, there's such a like veneer of like perfection, especially in typography and layout, that kind of, I feel like it creates this false mystery that like doesn't need to be there. And this kind of project was like unpacking a lot of that and like how do you share that in a way that like the 19-year-old version of myself could like pour over the notes of this book.
And I think also then alongside that, because also something that I always hope when people are looking at the work is then they leave the work and follow other trails. So like part of this and like working with the Polymode design is like so much of inspiration is these other books. So in the same way that like all of this is for me pulling these, it's building on all of these other projects. It's like, you know, I think about the catalog you did for with Amber at the VCU, the ICA VC, right? And this exhibition that I was in, but then you're working on the design, and so many of those things I feel like are citational references that way. But part of the process with this was also having like, you're very close to the work, Leslie's very close to the work, but you're also outside of the work, and so part of this challenge was for me, because I have so much information in my head. It was this thing of bouncing back and forth of like, how much do we need to put in there? How did you see it? Were the things that were the references and citations that were making sense to me, making sense to you? There was a push and pull back on whether or not we needed, let's say, names and index categories on the plates pages. And I was like, no, I want there to be only text on certain pages, the index, and then only plates, and that someone has to understand proximity. You know, like there were those sorts of conversations on citations and references. Each one of the texts that we pull into it, it also includes a footnote or a citation outside of this book to other places. So hopefully it just exists within a web of all these other things. Yeah.
I want to follow up a little bit, Paul, because I was curious again about that. Yeah, your desire to sort of reveal some of the information that's not apparent, and if I'm like similar to Silas, if that is like about being more generous with an audience, with the viewers that might know the work or people who don't know the work, and giving them more context, or where the impetus of the desire to do this sort of index project came from.
The impetus came from a frustration that I think many artists have experienced at certain points. It's like when your practice involves different bodies of work, and for whatever reason, those places where there's chances for it to be presented publicly, exhibition, etc., focus down on one aspect of it. But I kind of want to put it in context. So the idea for this began at a moment when just the mirror studies were circulating quite heavily, and there was a resistance to those other works that contextualized it. And I wanted to find a way to say, hey, when you're looking at this and when people are talking about obfuscation, concealing, fragmentation, there are whole subjects. There are whole lines of work that connect before this. And I'm interested in someone coming into this work in relation to, let's say, recognition or intimacy, etc., but that it is not fragmentation for the sake of like in a way of like erasing presence. And I wanted to pull all that together. Then winds change, and then you get an opportunity like to do, the survey in St. Louis, where suddenly for the first time I could bring everything together, and I was like, oh, this feels great. But I still wanted to do this project. And part of it is also because even though I wanted to slow down ways in which some of the work could circulate, I don't want to, years from now, lose my memory and all of the information is lost.
Although you do have a really detailed database.
I do, but part of this was also about putting that information into there. Yeah. But
I was given the sign that we should open it up to questions from the audience. I have a lot more, but hopefully some of you all have questions as well.